Good day, dear listener. Pull up a comfortable chair, pour yourself a cup of tea, and allow me to whisk you away to the sleepy English village of St. Mary Mead, sometime in the gentle autumn of 1952. The war is over, rationing is easing, and nothing ever happened. Except, of course, when Miss Jane Marple is about. You are about to hear a brand new adventure, Miss Marple and the Farm Tragedy. And now, let us begin. Chapter 1. A Body in the Orchard. The mist hung low over the apple orchard at Home Farm that crisp autumn morning in 1952, wrapping the gnarled trees in a soft, ethereal veil that muffled the world beyond. The air was thick with the scent of ripening fruit, a sweet, tangy perfume that mingled with the earthy dampness of the dew-soaked grass. Leaves turning gold and crimson rustled faintly in the gentle breeze as if whispering secrets to one another. It was the kind of morning that promised a day of quiet routines in the village of St. Mary Mead, where life moved at the leisurely pace of the seasons, undisturbed by the hustle of the cities or the lingering shadows of the war that had ended 7 years prior. Rationing was finally easing, and the villagers were beginning to rediscover small pleasures. A fresh loaf of bread without coupons, a bit of butter on toast. But on this particular day, the tranquility was about to be shattered in a way that would set tongues wagging from the post office to the vicarage. Young Tommy Pierce, a lad of 14 with freckles across his nose and a shock of unruly red hair, pedaled his bicycle along the narrow lane that bordered Home Farm. He was the postboy for the village, a job he had taken on with great enthusiasm after leaving school the previous summer. His basket was laden with letters and parcels, including a thick envelope from London for Mr. Reginald Proctor himself, the owner of the farm. Tommy whistled a tune from the wireless as he rode, his breath forming little clouds in the chill air. He enjoyed these early rounds. The world felt like his own private kingdom before the rest of St. Mary Mead stirred. As he approached the orchard gate, he slowed down, intending to hop off and deliver the mail to the farmhouse door as usual. But something caught his eye. A pair of sturdy leather boots protruding awkwardly from beneath the oldest Bramley apple tree. The one that stood like a sentinel at the edge of the field, its branches heavy with fruit that gleamed like jewels in the emerging sunlight. At first, Tommy thought it might be old Mr. Proctor taking a nap, perhaps after an early start to the day's work. The farmer was known for his gruff habits, rising before dawn to tend to his livestock and crops. But as Tommy drew closer, pushing his bicycle through the dew-wet grass, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning cold. The boots were attached to legs clad in worn corduroy trousers, and beyond that, a tweed jacket stained with what looked like dark, sticky mud. Or was it blood? Reginald Proctor lay on his back, his face turned skyward, eyes wide open in a frozen stare that seemed to accuse the heavens themselves. From his chest protruded the handle of a pitchfork, its tines buried deep, pinning him to the soft earth like a macabre butterfly in a collector's case. The ground around him was disturbed, grass trampled and apples scattered as if in the throes of a desperate struggle. Tommy's whistle died on his lips. His heart pounded in his ears, a frantic drumbeat that drowned out the birdsong. He dropped his bicycle with a clatter, the letters spilling from the basket like confetti at a grim celebration. A scream tore from his throat, raw and piercing, echoing across the fields and startling a flock of crows from the nearby hedgerow. They took to the sky in a black whirlwind, their caws adding to the cacophony. Tommy backed away, his legs feeling like jelly, until he tripped over a root and fell backward into the mud. He scrambled up and ran, his cries carrying to the farmhouse where Mrs. Birch, the daily help, was just beginning her chores. Mrs. Birch, a stout woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense apron tied around her ample waist and graying hair pulled into a tight bun, had been scrubbing the kitchen floor when she heard the commotion. She paused, mop in hand, water dripping onto the flagstones. At first, she thought it might be one of the farm cats yowling over a scrap, but the sound was human, desperate and terrified. Wiping her hands on her apron, she hurried to the door, her sensible shoes clacking against the stone. Outside, she saw Tommy racing toward her, his face as pale as milk, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Mrs. Birch! Mrs. Birch! It's Mr. Proctor. He's dead! In the orchard!" Mrs. Birch's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. She had worked for Mr. Proctor for nigh on a decade, handling the cleaning and cooking while he managed the farm with his iron fist. He wasn't an easy man, quick to anger, slow to praise. But death like this? She grabbed Tommy by the shoulders, steadying him. "Calm yourself, lad. What do you mean, dead? Show me." Together they hurried back to the orchard, Mrs. Birch's heart racing despite her outward composure. When they reached the spot, she saw it for herself. The body, the pitchfork, the unnatural stillness. Her basket of eggs, which she had absent-mindedly carried with her, slipped from her grasp. Shells cracked against the ground, yolks mingling with the dew in a grotesque parody of breakfast. Word spread like wildfire through St. Mary Mead. Tommy, after catching his breath, was sent to fetch Dr. Haydock from his surgery in the village center. The doctor, a kindly man with a bushy mustache and a penchant for pipe tobacco, arrived on his bicycle within minutes, his black bag strapped to the handlebars. By then, a small crowd had gathered at the orchard gate, neighbors drawn by the screams and the whispers that followed. There was old Mrs. Price from the cottage next door, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. Mr. Hawes, the grocer who had been opening his shop when Tommy burst in, and even the vicar, Reverend Clement, who happened to be passing on his morning walk. They stood in hushed clusters, gloved hands covering mouths, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity. In a village where the most exciting event was usually the annual flower show, a murder, for surely this was no accident, was unprecedented. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body, his face grim as he examined the wound. The pitchfork was one of Proctor's own, a sturdy tool with 4 sharp tines used for turning hay or lifting bales. It had been driven with considerable force, straight through the jacket and into the chest cavity. Blood had soaked the fabric, drying to a rusty brown in the cool air. Proctor's hands were clenched, knuckles white, as if he had grasped at his attacker in his final moments. The doctor checked for a pulse, though it was clear there would be none. "Dead," he confirmed, standing up and brushing dirt from his knees. "Likely for several hours. I'll need to notify the police at once." He glanced at the crowd. "No one touch anything. This is a crime scene now." As the villagers murmured among themselves, speculating in low tones about who could have done such a thing, the news made its way to the more genteel parts of St. Mary Mead. At Gossington Hall, where Miss Jane Marple was staying with her nephew Raymond West and his wife Joan, the atmosphere was one of cozy domesticity. The breakfast room overlooked a tidy garden where late blooming roses nodded in the breeze. Raymond, a successful author with a flair for the dramatic, was perusing the morning paper, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. Joan, elegant in a floral dress, was pouring tea from a silver pot, the steam rising in lazy curls. Miss Marple, an elderly lady with a deceptively frail appearance, white hair neatly pinned, blue eyes sharp as needles, sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pink woolen scarf for a great-niece. It was Joan who broke the peaceful silence, her voice laced with a hint of excitement. "Have you heard the news, Aunt Jane? Poor Mr. Proctor from Home Farm. He's been found dead in his orchard this morning. Tommy Pierce discovered him on his rounds." She set down the teapot with a clink, her eyes wide. "They say it's murder. A pitchfork right through him. Can you imagine?" Raymond lowered his newspaper, his interest piqued. As a writer of mystery novels, he found real-life intrigue irresistible, though he often dismissed the village gossip as too mundane for his plots. Murder? In St. Mary Mead? That's rather sensational, isn't it? Proctor was a bit of a curmudgeon from what I recall, always arguing with the neighbors about fences and such. But who would want to kill him? Miss Marple paused in her knitting, her needle still for a moment as she gazed out at the garden. She had known Reginald Proctor for years, in the way one knows everyone in a small village, through overheard conversations at the Women's Institute meetings, snippets from the church bazaar, and the occasional encounter at the local shops. He was a man in his late 60s, widowed for a decade with no children to soften his edges. His farm was prosperous, but his temperament was not. He had a habit of pinching pennies, docking wages for the slightest infraction, and feuding over land rights that dated back generations. "Poor Mr. Proctor," she murmured, her voice soft and thoughtful. "Though, as you say, Joan dear, he won't be widely missed. I remember last spring when he diverted the stream that runs along Captain Tarbutton's property. Caused no end of trouble for the captain's vegetable patch. And then there was young Elsie Tarbutton. Such a pretty girl, working as a milkmaid on the farm. He reduced her to tears only last week over some trifling matter with the accounts." Joan nodded vigorously, buttering a slice of toast with perhaps more force than necessary. Exactly. He was beastly to her. And not just her. Mrs. Hale, his housekeeper, put up with his moods for years. 15 years, I think she said at the last fete. Loyal as a dog, that woman, but even dogs have their limits. She passed the toast to Raymond, who accepted it absent-mindedly, his mind already spinning tales. Miss Marple sipped her tea, the china cup delicate in her arthritic hands. The brew was strong and hot, just as she liked it, with a splash of milk and no sugar. She found that tea had a way of clarifying thoughts, much like knitting helped unravel the knots of human behavior. "Murdered with a pitchfork," she said quietly, almost to herself. "How very agricultural. One wonders if it was a crime of passion or something more calculated. Pitchforks are not weapons one carries about casually. They're tools of the trade, always at hand on a farm like that." Raymond chuckled, folding his newspaper. "Aunt Jane, you sound as if you're already solving the case." "Leave it to the police, I say. Inspector Craddock will be along soon enough, no doubt. He's a sharp fellow from what I've heard." But there was a twinkle in his eye. He knew his aunt's reputation for keen observation, even if the villagers often underestimated the quiet old lady who spent her days gardening and knitting. Miss Marple smiled faintly, resuming her needles. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of interfering, Raymond dear. But one can't help noticing things in a place like St. Mary Mead. People are much the same everywhere, you know. Motives rooted in greed, jealousy, or fear. And Mr. Proctor had a way of stirring all three." Outside, the mist was lifting, revealing the rolling fields beyond the garden. In the distance, she could just make out the spire of the church and the cluster of cottages that formed the heart of the village. Somewhere amid those thatched roofs and chimney pots, a killer lurked, hidden in plain sight. As the morning progressed, the village came alive with the news. At the post office, Miss Weatherby, the postmistress with her pince-nez and perpetual frown, dispensed details along with stamps. "Tommy said the body was cold as stone," she confided to a queue of customers. "And the pitchfork, his own, mark you, driven right through like he was hay to be baled." Gasps rippled through the line. Down at the Blue Boar pub, though it was too early for opening, the landlord, Mr. Pye, was already polishing glasses and speculating with early arrivals. "Proctor owed me for a barrel of ale," he grumbled. "Now who's to pay? And young Billy Barnes was sacked last night for poaching. Threatened with the law, he was." stormed off in a rage. By midday, Inspector Dermot Craddock had arrived from the nearby town of Much Benham, his police car crunching gravel as it pulled up outside the farmhouse. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a gray suit with a polite manner that belied his sharp, investigative mind. He had crossed paths with Miss Marple before, during other village incidents that had proven more complex than they appeared. As he surveyed the scene, cordoning off the orchard with tape and directing constables to take photographs and measurements, he couldn't help but wonder if the old lady would turn up. Sure enough, as he paused for a moment on the lane, he spotted her neat figure seated on a bench outside the police cottage, a basket of knitting on her lap. "Aunt Jane," he exclaimed, though she was no blood relation, merely an honorary title born of fondness and respect. "I might have known you'd be mixed up in this somehow." Miss Marple looked up with a serene smile, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Only peripherally, Dermot dear. I'm staying with Raymond and Joan for a quiet fortnight away from my own cottage. But one does hear things, and I happen to know everyone concerned rather well from my visits here over the years." Craddock sat beside her, pulling out his notebook. "Well, since you're here, perhaps you can fill me in on the locals. Saves time." He listened attentively as she outlined the web of relationships and grudges that centered on Reginald Proctor. There was Captain Roger Tarbutton, the retired Indian Army officer whose land adjoined the farm, still bitter over the diverted stream that had flooded his garden during heavy rains. His niece Elsie, the milkmaid with the pretty face and quick temper who had threatened to do something drastic after her latest wage dispute. Then Gerald French, the slick young businessman from London who had been negotiating to buy Home Farm for development, only to be rebuffed repeatedly. Mrs. Laura Hale, the long-suffering housekeeper who had confided at a church meeting that Proctor's will left her nothing despite her years of service. And young Billy Barnes, the farmhand caught poaching rabbits the night before, dismissed on the spot with promises of prosecution. 5 people with reasons to wish him ill, Miss Marple concluded, her voice gentle, and doubtless more if one digs deeper. Human nature is predictable in its unpredictability, isn't it? Craddock nodded, closing his notebook. "Indeed. We'll start with alibis and motives, but a pitchfork, it's so personal. Suggests someone close, someone familiar with the farm." As the inspector returned to his duties, Miss Marple remained on the bench, her knitting progressing steadily. The village settled into an uneasy hush, the mist fully dissipated now, revealing a sky of pale blue. But beneath the surface, calm suspicions simmered, and Miss Marple knew that the threads of this tragedy would unravel in due time, stitch by stitch. Chapter 2. The 5 Who Stood to Gain. Inspector Dermot Craddock closed his notebook with a soft snap and looked at Miss Marple with the mixture of affection and exasperation he had felt ever since their first case together. The autumn sun had climbed higher, turning the village lane golden, and somewhere a blackbird sang as though murder were a commonplace occurrence. 5 people, he repeated under his breath. 5 perfectly good motives, and every one of them swears blind they never went near the orchard last evening. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and regarded him calmly. "People very often do swear blind, Dermot dear, particularly when their eyesight is perfectly good. Shall we walk to the farm? I find that places speak quite loudly when one listens." They set off together along the lane past cottage gardens bright with Michaelmas daisies and the last stubborn roses. Children playing hopscotch paused to stare. Mrs. Price from the end cottage bobbed a curtsy that was half greeting, half nosiness. By the time they reached the gate of Home Farm, the news of the inspector's companion had preceded them, and a small knot of villagers lingered at a respectful distance, pretending to examine cabbages in the hedge. The orchard itself was roped off now, two young constables standing guard like solemn herons. The body had been removed an hour earlier, but the pitchfork remained exactly where it had entered the earth, flagged with a little red marker. Craddock sighed. First, Captain Roger Tarbutton, he began, consulting his list. Retired Indian Army, lives at the Laurels with his niece. The stream business last April cost him half his vegetable crop and a prize marrow he'd been nursing for the county show. He was overheard in the Blue Boar saying he'd horsewhip Proctor if he ever laid hands on a gun again. Strong words. Miss Marple nodded. The captain is fond of strong words. He was fond of strong drink, too, when he was younger, but the war cured him of that. Still, anger lingers. They turned from the orchard toward the cluster of farm buildings. In the yard, Mrs. Laura Hale was feeding the hens with stiff mechanical movements, scattering grain as though each toss were an accusation. She was a tall woman, raw-boned, with iron-gray hair strained back beneath a felt hat. 15 years at home farm had left their mark, hands roughened by work, shoulders slightly stooped from carrying trays and coal scuttles. When she saw the inspector, she straightened, wiping her palms on her apron. "Morning, ma'am," Craddock said politely. "We'll need a statement in due course, but perhaps you could tell me, did Mr. Proctor mention any visitors yesterday?" Mrs. Hale's mouth tightened. "Only Mr. French from London pestering again about buying the place. Mr. Proctor sent him off with a flea in his ear, same as always. After that, he was in a rare temper. Said he'd walk the orchard to cool down before supper. I never saw him alive again." Her voice was flat, almost indifferent, yet Miss Marple noticed the way her fingers worried at the hem of her apron, twisting the cotton until it frayed. "And you yourself, Mrs. Hale? Where were you between 6 and 8? "In the kitchen, preparing his tray. Mutton broth and a baked egg. He liked a baked egg of an evening. I took it to the dining room at 7:30 and he wasn't there. I thought he'd stayed out longer than usual." She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "There's many that'll say I've cause to be glad he's gone. 15 years I gave him, and not so much as a cottage left me in the will. But I didn't kill him." Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically. "Loyalty is a heavy burden sometimes, Mrs. Hale. And disappointment heavier still." The housekeeper looked at her sharply, as though the gentle words had struck a nerve, then turned abruptly back to her hens. They found Captain Tarbutton in his garden, attacking a rose bush with secateurs as though it had personally offended him. His face was brick red, his mustache bristling. "Damned shame," he barked when Craddock explained their errand. "Proctor was a cad and a bounder, diverting my water like that, ruined my marrows." "But murder?" "Good Lord, no. I was polishing my service revolver last evening. Habit from India keeps the rheumatism at bay. And then Elsie and I played bezique until 10. Ask the girl." Pretty Elsie Tarbutton was in the dairy when they called next, her fair curls escaping from beneath a mob cap, sleeves rolled high as she rinsed milk churns. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Whether from grief or anger, it was hard to tell. "I hated him," she said simply, drying her hands on a towel. "He docked my wages twice last month for breakages that weren't my fault. Last week I told Mrs. Price in the shop I'd swing for him one day, but I didn't. I was here until 8, helping Uncle with supper, and then we played cards. I'm not strong enough to drive a pitchfork through a man anyway." Miss Marple studied the girl's slender arms and thought privately that anger can lend surprising strength, but she only murmured something soothing about shock and offered a barley sugar from her handbag. Gerald French, the London buyer, was staying at the Blue Boar. They found him in the lounge writing letters, sleek and immaculate in a pinstriped suit that looked out of place among the horse brasses and hunting prints. "Tragic business," he said smoothly, laying down his fountain pen. "Naturally, I'm devastated. I'd have paid a fair price for the farm, more than fair. Proctor was simply obstinate, but I was on the 5:15 from Paddington yesterday and didn't reach Milchester until nearly 8. The barman here served me a whiskey at 1/2 past. Receipts and witnesses galore, Inspector. He smiled with perfect teeth, and Miss Marple noticed that his hands were manicured, the nails shining. Not the hands of a man accustomed to wielding pitchforks. Last of all, they sought young Billy Barnes. He was sitting on an upturned bucket behind the cowsheds, smoking a cigarette with defiant misery. His left eye was bruised, and there was a graze on his knuckles. "Caught 2 rabbits on Proctor's land night before last," he muttered. "He sacked me on the spot and said he'd have me in court for poaching. I told him what he could do with his job, went straight to the Blue Boar and stayed till closing. Ask anyone. Got into a bit of a fight with Jack Simmons over darts, that's all. Landed me this shiner." Craddock measured him with a glance. "Size 9 boots, Barnes?" "Aye, and the left one's patched with rubber. Everyone's seen it. But I never went back to the orchard, I swear." As they walked away down the lane, the sun was sinking behind the church spire, painting the sky in rose and apricot. Miss Marple tucked her hand through the inspector's arm. "5 motives," she said softly, "each wrapped up with a neat little bow of alibi. Yet one of those bows is tied with string that will unravel at a touch. People are so rarely as simple as they wish to appear, are they, Dermot?" The inspector smiled ruefully. "You're going to tell me which one, aren't you?" "Not yet, dear. It's far too early for that. But I should very much like to know what time the London train actually reaches Milchester on a weekday evening. And whether anyone thought to look inside the apple loft." A breeze stirred the leaves overhead, and somewhere in the distance a church bell began to toll the hour. The day was ending as peacefully as it had begun, but beneath the calm surface of St. Mary Mead the currents of fear and guilt had only just begun to swirl. Chapter 3. Tea and Interrogations. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains of the vicarage drawing-room, casting intricate patterns on the faded Persian rug. Reverend Clement, a mild-mannered man with a scholarly stoop and wire-rimmed spectacles, had kindly offered his home as a neutral ground for the initial inquiries, reasoning that a cup of tea might ease the shock of the morning's grim discovery. The village of St. Mary Mead, though accustomed to its share of petty squabbles and minor scandals, had never quite faced anything as stark as murder. And the air hummed with a tense undercurrent of excitement and dread. Villagers passed the vicarage gate in 2s and 3s, pretending errands that brought them conveniently close, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves in the breeze. Inside, the room smelled of beeswax polish and the faint, comforting aroma of Darjeeling brewing in the kitchen, where Mrs. Clement bustled about with trays and scones. Miss Marple arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, her black straw hat pinned neatly and her sensible shoes clicking softly on the flagstone path. She carried a small reticule containing her knitting and a few barley sugars, items that often proved useful in loosening tongues. Inspector Craddock greeted her at the door, his expression a blend of professional gravity and personal warmth. "Aunt Jane, you're a godsend. The suspects are arriving one by one, and already the alibis are stacking up like dominoes. But something feels off. Too tidy, perhaps." Miss Marple smiled serenely, her blue eyes sharp as she surveyed the room. "Tidy alibis are often the messiest underneath, Dermot, dear. Like a ball of wool that's been wound too tightly. Pull one thread, and it all unravels." The first to arrive was Captain Roger Tarbutton, striding in with military precision, his boots polished to a gleam and his mustache twitching like an agitated caterpillar. He accepted a cup of tea with a grunt, stirring in 3 sugars as though fortifying himself for battle. "Damned inconvenient, this," he blustered, his voice booming in the quiet room. Proctor was a perfect nuisance, damming up that stream and flooding my lettuces. Cost me a fortune in replanting. But I didn't kill the blighter, if that's what you're implying. Last evening, I was at home cleaning my old service revolver. Keeps the fingers nimble, you know. Then Elsie and I sat down to a game of bezique. Girls sharp as a tack at cards beat me 2 rounds out of 3. He took a swig of tea, his ruddy face flushing deeper. Miss Marple, seated in a chintz armchair with her knitting in her lap, observed the way his hand trembled slightly on the saucer. Not rheumatism, she thought, but perhaps nerves. Next came Elsie Tarbutton herself, slipping into the room like a shadow, her pretty face pale beneath a dusting of powder, her curls arranged with care that spoke of recent attention in front of a mirror. She perched on the edge of a chair, accepting tea with murmured thanks, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When Craddock gently probed her whereabouts, she wept prettily into a lace handkerchief, the tears glistening but not quite smudging her mascara. "Oh, it's awful," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mr. Proctor was so cruel sometimes. Last week he accused me of spilling milk on purpose and docked my pay. I was in tears all afternoon, but I could never do such a thing." She dabbed at her eyes, glancing up through her lashes. "I was with Uncle Roger all evening. We had supper together, cold ham and salad, and then played cards until bedtime. I went straight to my room after that." Miss Marple noted the handkerchief's pristine folds and the way Elsie's sobs were perfectly timed, almost theatrical, like those of young Gladys in the village pantomime last Christmas. Gerald French arrived fashionably late, his city suit impeccable amid the vicarage's homely furnishings, a faint scent of cologne trailing him like an urban fog. He shook hands with Craddock smoothly, accepting tea with a nod and settling into a chair with the ease of a man used to boardrooms. "A shocking affair," he said, his voice polished as his shoes. "I had hoped to conclude business with Mr. Proctor amicably, but he was intractable about selling the farm still. Violence, unthinkable." When asked about his movements, he produced a railway ticket from his wallet with a flourish. "I was in London until this morning, Inspector. Caught the early train back after dining at my club last night. I can provide names. 3 colleagues who'll vouch for me. Arrived here just in time to hear the news." His smile was too even, Miss Marple thought, like a mask fitted a fraction too tightly, and his fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, a rhythm that betrayed impatience rather than grief. Mrs. Laura Hale followed, her tall frame rigid as she entered, her gray hair pulled back severely, her dress a somber black that seemed fitting for the occasion. She declined scones but took tea black, sipping it slowly as though measuring each drop. "I've nothing to hide," she said stiffly when Craddock began his questions. 15 years I gave that man, cooking, cleaning, mending his ways as best I could. And for what? Passed over in the will for some cousin in Australia he's never even met. But I didn't harm him. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and her left hand trembled as she set down the cup, the saucer rattling faintly. "Last evening I was in the kitchen from 5 onward preparing his supper. He went out to the orchard around 6. Said he'd be back by 7. When he wasn't, I left the tray and went to bed. Found him this morning, no. Tommy found him first." Miss Marple watched the tremor in that hand, wondering if it was exhaustion or something deeper like the suppressed fury of long-held resentments. Finally, young Billy Barnes slouched in, his cap twisted in his hands, his bruised eye a purple badge of last night's brawl. He refused tea, standing awkwardly by the mantelpiece, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the rug. "Ain't got much to say," he muttered, his voice surly. "Proctor caught me with them rabbits night before last. Sacked me right there, threatened to call the coppers. I was mad as hell, sure, but I didn't go back. Went straight to the Blue Boar and drowned me sorrows till closing. Ask the barman, or Jack Simmons. We had a scrap over darts, that's how I got this. He gestured to his eye, wincing. Stayed the night at me mum's after. Everyone saw me. His gaze darted around the room, defiant yet evasive, and Miss Marple noted the fresh mud on his boots. Size 9, with that distinctive patch on the left heel, just as the footprints in the orchard had shown. As the last interviewee departed, the room fell quiet save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Craddock rubbed his temples, his notebook filled with neat entries. Alibis all around, Aunt Jane. The captain and Elsie vouch for each other. French has his ticket and witnesses. Mrs. Hale was alone but claims routine. Barnes has the pub crowd. Yet someone was in that orchard. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, a few inches of pink scarf completed during the conversations. Indeed, Dermot, but notice how Mrs. Hale's hand shook on the left side. She's left-handed, you know, from years of stirring pots that way. And Elsie's tears left no mark on her powder. Real grief smudges, doesn't it? As for Mr. French's ticket, one wonders if it was punched correctly. She paused, her eyes thoughtful. Tea reveals so much, doesn't it? The way people stir, sip, or spill. Outside, the village settled into evening, lamps flickering on in cottage windows, but the interrogations had only stirred the pot, leaving clues simmering just below the surface. Chapter 4. The Matter of the Missing Watch. The late afternoon light filtered through the leaves of the apple orchard, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the trampled grass, where Reginald Proctor's body had lain only hours before. The police had finished their initial examination by midday. The surgeon from Much Benham, a brisk, efficient man named Dr. Griffiths with a clipboard and a no-nonsense mustache, declaring the time of death with clinical precision. Between 6 and 8 o'clock last evening, he announced to Inspector Craddock, his voice carrying across the field to where a few lingering villagers pretended not to eavesdrop. The body was cold, rigor just setting in when young Tommy found him. Cause is obvious. Exsanguination from the chest wound. But here's the curious bit. His watch stopped at precisely 7:14. Smashed, I'd say, during the altercation. The crystals shattered, hands frozen. Craddock nodded, jotting notes in his leather-bound book, the pages already filling with details from the morning's frenzy. The watch in question was a gold half-hunter, an heirloom piece that Proctor had been known to flash at village gatherings, its chain glinting like a badge of prosperity. It had been found clutched in his right hand, the face cracked as if struck by a heavy blow. "That narrows it," the inspector muttered. "Anyone with an alibi before 7:15 is in the clear. Or so it seems." He glanced toward the farmhouse where constables were still dusting for prints on the gate and tool shed. The pitchfork, now bagged, as evidence, had been confirmed as one from Proctor's own barn, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Miss Marple, having excused herself from the vicarage after the interrogations, decided on a gentle stroll back to her nephew's house. The air was crisp, carrying the faint tang of wood smoke from distant chimneys, and the path wound conveniently past the orchard's edge. She walked slowly, her cane tapping softly on the gravel, her eyes sharp despite her age, scanning the scene with the casual interest of a bird watcher. The rope barrier fluttered in the breeze, and a solitary constable nodded politely as she passed. "Evening, ma'am. Best not get too close, it's still under investigation." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of interfering, young man. Just taking the air. Such a peaceful spot, usually." As she ambled along the fence, her gaze fell upon the oldest Bramley tree, the one under which the body had been discovered. Its trunk, gnarled and weathered, bore the scars of many seasons, lichen patches, old pruning cuts. But there, at about shoulder height for a man of average stature, was a fresh gouge. The bark had been freshly splintered, wood pale and exposed, as if something hard had been flung against it with force. Miss Marple paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. The mark was precise, not the random scrape of a branch or animal, but deliberate, perhaps calculated. She recalled the surgeon's words about the smashed watch and pondered. If Proctor had been grappling with his attacker, might the watch have been hurled in the struggle? Or, and this thought lingered like a shadow, was it smashed intentionally away from the body to mislead about the exact time? She said nothing to the constable, merely nodding again and continuing her walk. But the observation tucked itself away in her mind like a stray thread in her knitting basket, waiting to be woven into the pattern. Back at Gossington Hall, over a light supper of poached eggs and toast, she mentioned it casually to Raymond and Joan. "Such a pity about Mr. Proctor's watch," she sighed, buttering her bread. "A family piece, I believe. Stopped at 7:14, they say." Joan leaned forward, eager for details. "Do you think that's when it happened, Aunt Jane? Right in the middle of evening chores?" Raymond, ever the storyteller, chuckled. "Sounds like something from one of my novels. A timed clue pointing straight to the killer." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Clues are rarely so straightforward, dear. Watches can be persuasive, but not always truthful." The village buzzed with the new information as evening fell. At the Blue Boar, patrons clustered around the bar, pints in hand, debating the timeline. 7:14 sharp, Mr. Pye, the landlord, boomed, polishing a glass. "That lets out young Billy. He was here by 7, nursing his ale like a babe with a bottle." Nods rippled through the crowd, but old Mr. Hawes, the grocer, shook his head. "Alibis are fine, but who had the strength? Pitchfork through a man like that. Takes a farmer's arm or anger like thunder." Whispers turned to Gerald French, the outsider with his city ways, or Captain Tarbutton with his military temper. Elsie Tarbutton's name surfaced too, though dismissed with chuckles. "A slip of a girl? Nah, couldn't lift the thing." Miss Marple, retiring early to her room with a hot water bottle and her knitting, pondered the watch further. She had seen similar deceptions before in the quiet scandals of St. Mary Mead's past. A clock tampered with during a theft at the vicarage, or a wristwatch lost to cover a rendezvous. Human nature, she mused, loved to manipulate time, bending it to fit alibis or motives. If the watch had been smashed against the tree deliberately, then the death might have occurred earlier, before the rain that had muddied the footprints. And who would benefit from such misdirection? Someone whose alibi hinged on those precious minutes, perhaps. The next morning dawned bright, frost rhyming the window panes like lace. Miss Marple joined Raymond and Joan for breakfast, the wireless humming softly with news from London. Inspector Craddock arrived unannounced, his hat in hand, a faint smile creasing his face. "Aunt Jane, I hoped I'd find you here. The lab boys have confirmed the watch was stopped by impact. Glass shards match the damage. But there's no blood on it, which is odd if it was in his hand during the attack." Miss Marple poured him tea. "Odd indeed, Dermot. One might almost think it was added after the fact." He raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting staging, but why?" She stirred her cup thoughtfully. "To point us toward a time that suits the killer. Check the tree trunk, dear, the old Bramley. There's a mark that might tell a story." Craddock departed with a promise to investigate, and Miss Marple spent the morning in the garden pruning late-blooming asters while her mind wandered back to the suspects. Mrs. Hale, with her trembling left hand, strong from years of labor, capable of wielding a pitchfork. Gerald French, whose train alibi placed him arriving just after 7:28, conveniently past the watch's time. If the death was earlier, say at 6, his story held, but if later, it crumbled. And the Tarbuttons, uncle and niece bound by family, their card game a mutual shield. Billy Barnes, with his pub brawl, seemed safest, yet his patched boot matched the prints. By lunchtime, Craddock returned, his expression intrigued. You were right about the scar on the tree, fresh and at the perfect height for a thrown object. Fibers from Proctor's cuff embedded in the bark, too. The watch wasn't smashed in the struggle, it was hurled there afterward. Miss Marple nodded over cucumber sandwiches. A clever touch, but overthought. Killers often are their own worst enemies, adding flourishes that betray them. The village, learning of this twist through the inevitable grapevine, shifted suspicions anew. Whispers at the post office suggested foul play beyond mere rage, a planned deception pointing to someone cunning. As dusk approached once more, Miss Marple revisited the orchard path, the air cooler now, leaves crunching underfoot. The scar on the tree gleamed faintly in the fading light, a silent witness. She tucked another observation away. The angle of the mark suggested a left-handed throw, the force from someone tall. Human puzzles, she reflected, were like her knitting. Pull the right thread, and the whole design emerged. The matter of the missing watch, or rather the misplaced one, was unraveling nicely. Chapter 5. Footprints in Wellington Boots. A thin, steady rain began to fall shortly after 9 o'clock on the night of the murder, turning the lanes of St. Mary Mead into glossy ribbons and drumming softly on every roof and window pane. By morning, the orchard soil was sodden, the grass flattened, and the place where Reginald Proctor had died looked as though a herd of cattle had passed through it. Yet among the chaos of trampled earth, one set of footprints stood out clearly, deep, deliberate impressions leading away from the body toward the back gate that opened onto the footpath to the village. Size 9. Wellington boots, the left heel reinforced with a distinctive oval patch of motor tire rubber. The patch had left its own small crescent signature in the mud, unmistakable. Constable Peters, young and eager to impress, spotted them first. He crowed with triumph as he pointed them out to Inspector Craddock. "That's Billy Barnes's boot, sir. Everyone knows he patched it himself last week after he trod on a rake. Said the tire came off old Mr. Fletcher's Morris. Can't be two pairs the same, not in St. Mary Mead." Craddock crouched under an umbrella, pipe clenched between his teeth, and studied the prints. They began a yard from the body, ran straight for 20 feet, then veered sharply left toward the gate. After the gate, there was only the metalled lane where the rain had washed all trace away. "Clear as day," Peters went on. "Billy was sacked the night before, threatened all sorts, then came back in the dark and did for the old man. Case closed, I'd say." By 10 o'clock, the village had decided the same. In the post office queue in the doorway of the butcher's outside the Blue Boar, though it was barely opening time, the verdict was unanimous. Billy Barnes, poacher hothead, wearer of size 9 patched boots, had murdered Reginald Proctor and would hang for it. Mrs. Price bought an extra stamp just so she could linger and repeat the news to Miss Weatherby. "Mark my words, he'll be in the dock by Friday." Miss Marple heard the chorus of certainty while she collected her nephew's copy of the Times. She listened without comment, paid for a reel of pale blue wool, and walked thoughtfully home through the drizzle. At Gossington Hall, she found Joan agog with the latest gossip. "It's all over, Aunt Jane. Billy's boots matched the prints exactly. The police have gone to fetch him now." Miss Marple removed her rain-spotted spectacles and polished them on a lace handkerchief. "Have they indeed? How very convenient for someone." Joan blinked. "Convenient, but it's proof, isn't it?" "Proof is a large word, dear. Boots are common articles, and patches are easily made or removed." She settled herself by the fire with her knitting. "I should be interested to know whether young Billy is left-handed or right-handed. No one seems to have asked." That afternoon, Inspector Craddock called again, damp from the rain and faintly exasperated. "The village has tried and convicted Billy Barnes already," he said, accepting a cup of tea. The boot prints are damning and he hasn't helped himself, admits he was furious, admits he owns the boots, can't deny the patch. Yet something nags at me. The direction of the tines, for one thing. The pitchfork entered from the left side of the chest. A right-handed man would usually strike from his stronger side. Miss Marple poured milk with a steady hand. Precisely, Dermot. And the footprints themselves. Did you notice how evenly spaced they are? Almost as though the wearer were walking quite calmly away from the scene, not running in panic or guilt. Murderers who have just stabbed a man through the heart tend to run. Craddock stared. You think the prints were made afterwards? I think it would be simple enough on a wet night to borrow a pair of boots, walk backwards from the gate to the body, heeling and toeing carefully so the prints point away, and then walk forward again in the same track wearing ordinary shoes. The rain would blur any confusion, and who would notice an extra set of prints leading toward the body when everyone is looking for prints leading away? Craddock set down his cup. That's devilish clever. Murderers often are when they believe themselves safe. Tell me, has anyone examined Billy's boots since yesterday? They're still on his feet, muddy, patched, exactly as described. Miss Marple smiled gently. Then perhaps we should ask Billy to walk for us, across a nice clean piece of lino, say, with a little flour sprinkled on it. One can tell a great deal from the way a man plants his weight. Half an hour later, in the yard behind the police cottage, the experiment was conducted. Billy, sullen and frightened, was persuaded to don his boots and stride across a stretch of flour-dusted tarpaulin while Constable Peters watched eagerly. The left heel left its crescent mark, true enough, but the pressure was heaviest on the outer edge, exactly as a right-footed man walks when he is perfectly sober and unafraid. Now, said Miss Marple softly, ask him to walk backwards. Billy obeyed clumsily, arms out for balance. The prints were different, shallower at the toe, deeper at the heel, and slightly staggered where he had hesitated. Craddock exhaled slowly. Not the same at all. Exactly, whoever made those prints in the orchard walked backwards with confidence, knowing exactly where to place each foot. Billy would have fallen over his own shadow. The inspector rubbed his chin. So the boots were borrowed or stolen, and the prints laid as a blind. Or, Miss Marple added, the patch itself was added for the occasion. A scrap of tire, a few tacks, and any boot becomes Billy's boot. It is surprising how little observation most people bring to the things they see every day. Craddock looked at her with admiration and a touch of dread. Then we're back where we started. Not quite. We know now that someone went to considerable trouble to point the finger at Billy Barnes. That is instructive. It suggests the real murderer felt Billy was a danger or a convenience, and it suggests they had access to the farm buildings where spare boots are kept and time to plan. The rain had stopped. A weak sun glinted on puddles. In the distance, the church clock struck 4. Miss Marple gathered her umbrella. I believe I shall take another little walk past the orchard, Dermot. Mud can tell such interesting stories when one knows how to read them. As she left, Craddock watched her go. The small, neat figure in the old-fashioned coat moving with quiet purpose. He had the feeling, familiar now, that the case had turned a corner, and that the footprints, far from closing the matter, had opened it wide. Chapter 6. The alibi that was too good. The following day brought a deceptive calm to St. Mary Mead, the kind that follows a storm, where the air feels washed clean but the ground remains treacherous underfoot. The rain from the previous night had ceased, leaving puddles that mirrored the patchy blue sky and a freshness to the hedgerows that bordered the lanes. Villagers went about their routines with a heightened sense of awareness. Glances exchanged over garden fences, conversations hushed in the shops, as if the murder of Reginald Proctor had infused the ordinary with an undercurrent of suspense. At the Blue Boar, the midday crowd was thicker than usual. Locals nursing pints and dissecting the latest rumors about Billy Barnes's boots and the damning footprints. "He's for the noose, mark my words," muttered Mr. Pye behind the bar, though even he sounded less certain now that whispers of planted evidence had begun to circulate. Miss Marple, ever the observer of such shifts in village mood, spent the morning in quiet reflection at Gossington Hall. She sat in the conservatory, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on the pink scarf, her mind piecing together the fragments of the case like stitches in a pattern. Raymond had buried himself in his study, tapping away at his typewriter on some new literary endeavor, while Joan flitted about the house, unable to settle. "It's all so unsettling, Aunt Jane," she confided over Elevence's setting down a tray of tea and seed cake. "First the watch, then the boots. Who knows what twist will come next?" Miss Marple accepted a slice of cake with a nod. "Twists are inevitable, dear, but they often straighten themselves if one waits patiently." It was during this repast that Inspector Craddock arrived, his car splashing through a puddle outside the gate. He entered with a purposeful stride, hat in hand, his face bearing the lines of a man who had spent the night poring over reports. "Aunt Jane, Mrs. West," he greeted them, accepting a chair and a cup of tea. "I've been verifying alibis, and Gerald French's stands out like a sore thumb, or rather like a thumb that's been manicured too perfectly." He pulled out his notebook, flipping to a marked page. "The man's story is airtight. Not only does he have his railway ticket from this morning's train back from London, but he's produced affidavits from 3 witnesses, colleagues from his firm, who swear he dined with them at his club until 11 last night. They even recalled the menu: roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, and a rather fine claret." Joan leaned forward, intrigued. "But that's good for him, isn't it? Proves he couldn't have been in the orchard." Craddock shook his head. "It's rather too good. Most people scramble for alibis. French had his ready almost before I asked. And those witnesses, all business associates who stand to gain if he acquires home farm for development. It's convenient." Miss Marple crumbled a bit of seed cake between her fingers, her expression thoughtful. "Rather too impeccable, Dermot, dear. When a man takes quite so much trouble to prove he was 50 miles away, one wonders if perhaps he wasn't." She sipped her tea delicately. "And the timing. Have you checked the train schedules?" Craddock nodded, his eyes lighting with appreciation. "I have. The train French claims to have taken back this morning left Paddington at 6:45 a.m., arriving at Milchester at 8:12. But last night, he says he was at the club until 11, then retired to his flat. No mention of returning earlier. Yet the smashed watch stopped at 7:14 p.m., before the last train from London could have brought him here in time for the murder." Joan frowned. "But if he was in London, how could he have done it?" Miss Marple set down her cup. "That's the point, dear. If the watch was tampered with, as we suspect, the death could have been earlier, say around 6, when French's alibi is vaguer. He claims meetings all afternoon, but no one to confirm after 5. And that ticket he flashed so readily, was it for yesterday's travel or today's?" Craddock jotted a note. "We'll wire the club in his flat. But there's more. French was seen in the village 2 days ago arguing with Proctor again about the sale. Mrs. Hale overheard him say, 'You'll regret this, old man, one way or another.' Threatening, but vague. The conversation turned to the other suspects, each alibi probed like a loose tooth. Captain, Tarbutton, and Elsie claimed their card game, but who could verify beyond their word? Mrs. Hale, alone in the kitchen, her routine unchallenged. Billy Barnes at the pub, his fight with Jack Simmons witnessed by half the bar. But fights could be staged, distractions created. "It's like a jigsaw where pieces fit too easily," Craddock mused. Someone's forcing the picture. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. Perhaps a visit to the Blue Boar would help. Landlords hear everything, and Mr. Pye has a memory like an elephant. They agreed, and soon the trio set off, umbrellas at the ready against the fickle sky. The pub was cozy inside, logs crackling in the grate, the air thick with pipe smoke and the scent of ale. Mr. Pye greeted them with a nod, polishing a glass. "Inspector, ma'am, come about the murder? Village is fair buzzing." Craddock ordered a half-pint for form's sake. "Mr. French, was he in here last night?" Pye shook his head. "Not last night, but yesterday afternoon I nursed a whiskey, looking pleased with himself. Said something about closing a deal soon. Left around 4. Miss Marple, perched on a stool with a small sherry, listened as Pye elaborated. "And Billy? Rowdy as usual, but he left before closing, said he was heading home. No, wait. Jack Simmons dragged him out after the punch-up." Joan whispered to Miss Marple, "Does that change anything?" The old lady's eyes narrowed. "It might. If Billy left early, his alibi weakens after 10. As they departed, a fresh lead emerged. A villager claimed to have seen a London-plated car parked near the farm lane the evening of the murder, engine idling. "Could be French's," Craddock said excitedly. "He drives a Morris Oxford, city plates." Back at the hall, over more tea, Miss Marple unraveled further. The alibi is too good because it's prepared, French anticipated scrutiny. But why the pitchfork? A city man would bring a weapon. This was opportunistic, farm-born rage. Craddock paced. Unless he staged that too, used the pitchfork to point to a local. "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed. "But over-elaboration betrays. Check his witnesses, perhaps one cracks." By evening, a telegram arrived. One colleague admitted French left the club at 9, not 11. "A crack," Craddock crowed. Yet Miss Marple cautioned, "A false lead, perhaps. The real killer wants us chasing French." The day closed with the village abuzz, alibis fracturing like autumn leaves. Chapter 7. The Secret of the Apple Loft. A golden haze settled over St. Mary Mead as the afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the rooftops and chimneys in warm amber tones. The village had entered that peculiar phase following a tragedy where daily life resumed with a veneer of normalcy, yet every conversation carried an undercurrent of speculation and unease. At the post office, Miss Weatherby dispensed stamps alongside theories about Gerald French's too-perfect alibi. In the grocer's, Mr. Hawes weighed out sugar while pondering the significance of the tampered watch. Miss Marple, attuned to these ripples as a spider to its web, decided it was time to pay another visit to Home Farm. She had a pretext ready. A craving for Cox's orange pippins, those crisp, tangy apples that Home Farm was renowned for producing. Armed with a wicker basket and her ever-present knitting bag, she set off along the lane, her steps measured and deliberate, as if she were merely an elderly lady out for a pleasant errand. The farm gate creaked as she pushed it open, the sound echoing across the yard where a few hens scratched lazily in the dirt. Mrs. Laura Hale emerged from the dairy, wiping her hands on her apron, her face etched with the weariness of someone who had endured too many questions from the police and too few hours of sleep. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice flat but polite, "what brings you here? The orchard's still roped off, as you know." Miss Marple smiled warmly, holding up her basket. "Oh, nothing to do with that dreadful business, Mrs. Hale. I was hoping to buy a few of your fine Cox's apples. Joan raves about them for her tarts, and I thought I'd surprise her." The housekeeper hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the barn, but then nodded. "Very well. I've a bushel in the dairy. Wait here, I'll fetch them." As Mrs. Hale disappeared into the cool shadows of the dairy, Miss Marple glanced around the yard. The barn loomed nearby, its weathered doors ajar, revealing stacks of hay and farm tools within. Above the main floor was the apple loft, accessible by a sturdy wooden ladder propped against the wall, a place where surplus fruit was stored through the winter, along with odds and ends that accumulated on a working farm. Miss Marple had heard mention of it in passing conversations at the Women's Institute. Proctor had been proud of his storage methods, boasting about the loft's ventilation that kept apples fresh until spring. With Mrs. Hale occupied, Miss Marple moved quietly toward the barn, her cane sinking slightly into the soft earth. She paused at the ladder's base, listening for any sound from the dairy. Satisfied, she tucked her basket under one arm and began to climb. Her movements surprisingly agile for her age, though she gripped the rungs firmly to steady herself. The loft was dim and musty, lit only by slivers of light filtering through gaps in the boarded walls. The air carried the faint, sweet rot of last year's straw, piled in heaps along the edges, and the sharper scent of stored apples in wooden crates stacked neatly in rows. Miss Marple stepped carefully onto the creaking floorboards, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. She had no specific expectation, only a nagging intuition that the farm held secrets beyond the obvious. Places where one might hide something in haste, assuming no one would look. She moved toward the back, where the straw was deepest, her cane prodding gently ahead like a divining rod. It was there, half buried beneath a mound of yellowed hay, that she found it, a second pitchfork, identical to the one that had ended Reginald Proctor's life. Its tines gleamed faintly, clean and unused, unlike the bloodied murder weapon now in police custody. Miss Marple knelt carefully, her knees protesting, and brushed away more straw. Beside the pitchfork lay a man's coat, tweed much like Proctor's own, but this one had a torn pocket hanging by threads and a faint rust-colored stain on the cuff that looked suspiciously like dried blood, still fresh enough to suggest it hadn't been there long. Her heart quickened slightly. This was no accident of storage. Someone had concealed these items here deliberately, perhaps in the panic following the crime, or as part of a calculated plan. With delicate fingers, she reached into the torn pocket, feeling the crinkle of paper. Out came a single railway ticket, a return from London to Milchester, dated the previous day. The edges were crisp, the ink unfaded. It hadn't been crumpled or weathered. Miss Marple turned it over in her hand, noting the punch mark from the conductor. This tied directly to Gerald French's alibi, the man who claimed to have been in London until that very morning. But why hide it here with a bloody coat and a spare pitchfork? She slipped the ticket into her reticule for safekeeping, her mind racing through possibilities. The coat could belong to anyone, Proctor himself or a farmhand. But the tear and stain suggested violence, a struggle perhaps. And the pitchfork. Why a second one? To replace the murder weapon, making it seem as though nothing was amiss in the tool shed? A sound from below, the dairy door banging shut, jolted her. Mrs. Hale was returning. Miss Marple quickly rearranged the straw to cover her discoveries, though not perfectly. She wanted them found eventually, but on her terms. She descended the ladder with care, reaching the bottom just as the housekeeper rounded the corner with a paper bag of apples. "Here you are," Mrs. Hale said, her eyes narrowing slightly at Miss Marple's position by the barn. "Wandering, were we?" Miss Marple beamed innocently. "Oh, just admiring the architecture, dear. These old barns have such character. How much do I owe you?" She paid with coins from her purse, chatting idly about recipes to deflect suspicion, then bid farewell and made her way back to the lane. Once out of sight, she paused under a hedgerow to catch her breath and organize her thoughts. The loft's secrets pointed to premeditation. The hidden pitchfork suggested the killer had brought a clean one to swap, or perhaps used the spare to commit the deed while leaving the original in place. The coat, with its bloodstain, might have been worn by the murderer, discarded to avoid evidence. And the ticket. That screamed of Gerald French, but was it too obvious? A plant to incriminate him, or genuine proof of his presence? French had motive, the thwarted farm purchase, but his alibi, though overly polished, held elements of truth. Yet if he had returned earlier, slipping into the village unnoticed. Back at Gossington Hall, Miss Marple shared her findings with Inspector Craddock over afternoon tea in the drawing room. He arrived promptly after her summons, his face a mask of professional curiosity. "Aunt Jane, you shouldn't be climbing ladders at your age," he chided gently, though his eyes sparkled with interest as she produced the ticket. "This changes everything. French's alibi crumbles if he was here yesterday." Miss Marple nodded, slicing a piece of fruitcake. "But consider, Dermot, why hide it in the loft? Accessible to anyone on the farm, Mrs. Hale, Billy, even the Tarbuttons if they trespassed. And the coat, check the lining, it might have a tailor's mark." Craddock examined the ticket closely. "Dated yesterday, return fare. If French lost it during the murder," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "or if someone placed it there to mislead. Human nature loves a scapegoat, especially an outsider like Mr. French." The inspector pocketed the evidence. "We'll search the loft properly now. If there's a second pitchfork in that coat—" As evening fell, the police descended on Home Farm, lanterns bobbing in the twilight. Mrs. Hale watched stone-faced as they uncovered the items, her left hand clenching at her side. The village, learning of the drama through the grapevine, buzzed anew. Miss Marple, knitting by the fire, pondered the threads. A hidden loft, a planted ticket, a stained coat. The pattern was emerging stitch by stitch. Chapter 8. The Broken Ladder. The twilight descended softly over St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a cloak of deepening blue punctuated by the warm glow of lamps flickering to life in cottage windows. The air carried a chill now, a harbinger of the approaching winter, and the leaves that had clung stubbornly to the trees were finally surrendering, drifting down in lazy spirals to carpet the lanes. Miss Marple, returning from her eventful visit to Home Farm, felt the day's discoveries weighing on her like an unfinished row of knitting, tantalizingly close to completion, yet requiring a few more careful stitches. She had confided in Inspector Craddock about the hidden items in the apple loft, and he had promised a thorough search. But she knew that the human elements of the puzzle were as crucial as the physical clues. With that in mind, she decided to make a couple of discreet calls that evening, before the village settled fully into its nocturnal routines. First, she directed her steps toward the Laurels, the neat Georgian house where Captain Roger Tarbutton resided with his niece Elsie. The path was lined with laurel hedges trimmed with military precision, and the brass knocker on the door gleamed under the porch light. Elsie answered the door, her pretty face framed by a halo of lamplight, though her eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there before the murder. "Miss Marple, it's rather late for calling," she said, though her tone was polite. Miss Marple smiled apologetically, holding up a small jar of homemade blackberry jam. "Forgive the intrusion, dear. I was passing and thought you might like this. Joan made extra this autumn, and I wondered if I might have a quick word with your uncle. It won't take but a moment." Elsie hesitated, then stepped aside. "He's in the study. I'll fetch him." The interior of the Laurels was comfortably furnished, with remnants of the captain's Indian service evident in the tiger skin rug and the crossed kukris on the wall. Captain Tarbutton emerged moments later, his mustache bristling, a glass of whiskey in hand. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe this pleasure? Come for more interrogations, eh?" His bluster was familiar, a shield against discomfort, but Miss Marple detected a note of unease beneath it. She settled into an offered armchair, her knitting bag on her lap. "Not at all, Captain, just a chat among neighbors. I recall you mentioning your old army revolver the other day at the vicarage. Do you still keep it? Such a fine piece from what I've heard." The captain puffed up slightly, setting down his glass. "Certainly do. Webley Mark IV saw me through the Boer War and beyond. Polished it just last evening, as a matter of fact. Keeps the fingers supple despite the damned rheumatism. But what has that to do with pitchforks and poor old Proctor?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Oh, nothing directly, dear, though one does wonder about weapons in a village like this. And speaking of your rheumatism, do you still climb the orchard ladder to pick the high apples yourself? I remember you boasting about your prize coxes at the flower show last year." The captain flushed crimson, his ruddy complexion deepening to a shade resembling overripe plums. He cleared his throat, glancing toward the window as if seeking escape. "Well now, that is, a man doesn't let a bit of stiffness stop him, does he? Tradition, you know. But why ask?" Miss Marple merely smiled, her needles beginning to click as she pulled out her wool. "Curiosity, Captain. The mind wanders in old age. Thank you for the chat. And do enjoy the jam." She rose gracefully, leaving the captain sputtering mild protests as Elsie showed her out. The flush on his face lingered in her mind as she walked away. Embarrassment, certainly, but was it more? Climbing ladders with rheumatism suggested either stubborn pride or necessity. Perhaps to reach something hidden like the apple loft at home farm. The Tarbuttons' property adjoined Proctor's after all. A quick hop over the hedge would be simple for a fit man, or even a determined girl like Elsie. Her next destination was home farm itself, where the police search was winding down. Lanterns bobbed in the yard as constables packed away their kits, and Inspector Craddock met her at the gate, his face illuminated by the beam. "Aunt Jane, you shouldn't be out in this chill. We found what you described, the pitchfork, the coat, the ticket. French is being questioned now at the station." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Excellent, Dermot. But I thought I'd have a word with Mrs. Hale if she's still about. Loose ends, you know." The inspector escorted her to the farmhouse kitchen, where Mrs. Hale sat at the scrubbed pine table, a cup of cold tea before her, her tall frame slumped in exhaustion. The room smelled of carbolic soap and leftover stew, the ticking clock on the mantel the only sound. "Mrs. Hale," Miss Marple began, gently taking a seat opposite. "I won't keep you long. Such a trying day for you." The housekeeper looked up, her gray eyes shadowed. "What more is there to say? They've turned the place upside down." Miss Marple leaned forward sympathetically. "Indeed. But I wondered if you'd noticed something about the orchard ladder, the one leaning against the old bramley tree. Has it always had that broken third rung on the left side?" Mrs. Hale went very white, her hand gripping the teacup until her knuckles blanched. The color drained from her face as if a tap had been opened, leaving her skin as pale as the china. The ladder? I don't know what you mean. It's just an old thing, been there years." Her voice trembled, the words tumbling out too quickly. Miss Marple observed the reaction calmly, her own expression one of mild concern. "Oh, but surely you have. You climb it often, don't you? To store apples in the loft or fetch down baskets. A strong woman like you, farm work builds such resilience. But that rung, loose for weeks, they say. Anyone unfamiliar with it might step wrong and tumble." Mrs. Hale stared, her left hand, the trembling one, clenching into a fist. Why bring that up now?" Miss Marple sighed softly. "Because, dear, the killer returned to the loft today, didn't they? To hide or retrieve those items. Only someone who knew the ladder intimately would climb it without hesitation, avoiding that faulty rung instinctively. A stranger like Mr. French might not." The housekeeper's composure cracked then, a single tear tracing down her cheek. 15 years, she whispered, and he tossed me aside like yesterday's milk. Craddock, listening from the doorway, stepped forward. Mrs. Hale, if there's something you wish to say. But she shook her head fiercely, wiping her face. Nothing. I've said nothing. Miss Marple rose, patting the woman's arm. Think on it, dear. Secrets have a way of festering. Outside, under the starry sky, Craddock walked her partway home. You rattled her, Aunt Jane. The broken rung. How did you spot that? Miss Marple chuckled lightly. Observation, Dermot. When I climbed the barn ladder earlier, I noticed a similar one in the orchard, half hidden by ivy. The wood was splintered on the left, third from the bottom. And Mrs. Hale, she favors her left hand for everything, stirring tea, feeding hens. A left-handed climb would stress that side. The inspector whistled softly. So she's our climber. But does that make her the killer? Miss Marple gazed at the moonlit fields. Not necessarily, but it narrows the field. The captain blushes at ladders, Mrs. Hale pales. Human reactions are such reliable clues. As they parted, the village clock struck 8, its chimes carrying on the night air. Miss Marple retired to bed with a sense of progress. The broken ladder, a pivotal rung in the ladder of evidence leading to the truth. Chapter 9. The dramatic revelation and confrontation. The golden hues of a Saturday afternoon bathed the vicarage in a serene light, the kind that suggested all was right with the world, even as shadows of suspicion lingered in the corners of St. Mary Mead. The drawing room, with its chintz curtains and well-worn armchairs, had been prepared for the gathering. A low table set with tea things, though no one seemed inclined to partake, and chairs arranged in a semicircle facing the fireplace. Reverend Clement hovered nervously by the mantel, adjusting a vase of Michaelmas daisies while his wife bustled in with a plate of biscuits that went untouched. Inspector Dermot Craddock stood at the center, tall and composed, his notebook tucked away for the moment, as the suspects filed in one by one, their faces a mosaic of curiosity, defiance, and barely concealed anxiety. Captain Roger Tarbutton arrived first, blustering through the door with his niece Elsie in tow. He settled into a chair with a harumph, his mustache twitching as he glanced around. What's all this about, Inspector? Some sort of parlor game? Elsie, pale but composed, smoothed her skirt and sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Gerald French followed, sleek as ever in his city suit, offering a polite nod to the room before choosing a seat near the window, his expression one of detached interest. Young Billy Barnes slouched in next, cap in hand, his bruised eye fading to a yellowish hue. He perched on the edge of a stool, eyeing the others warily. Last came Mrs. Laura Hale, her tall frame rigid, her gray hair pinned severely as she took the remaining chair with the air of someone attending her own trial. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in the corner, an unobtrusive figure in her black dress and lace collar, her knitting needles clicking softly like the ticking of a distant clock. She had insisted on this assembly, whispering to Craddock that the time had come to knit the threads together. The inspector cleared his throat, drawing all eyes to him. Thank you for coming, everyone. As you know, Reginald Proctor was murdered in his orchard 3 days ago, stabbed with his own pitchfork. We've gathered clues, alibis, and motives, but today we'll lay it all bare. Murmurs rippled through the room. Captain Tarbutton's gruff, "About time," Elsie's soft gasp, French's smooth, "I'm all ears." Craddock paced slowly, his voice measured. We know the murderer returned to the scene this morning, likely to retrieve something from the apple loft in the barn. Our search uncovered a man's coat with a torn pocket and a blood stain, a clean pitchfork identical to the murder weapon, and a railway ticket from London to Milchester, dated yesterday. He paused dramatically, letting the words sink in. Gasps echoed. Billy muttered, "Not mine." while French leaned forward, his composure cracking slightly. "That ticket proves nothing. Anyone could have planted it." Craddock nodded. "Indeed, but there's more. The killer is left-handed. Billy Barnes is right-handed. We tested him." The pitchfork entered Proctor's chest from the left at an angle suggesting a leftward strike. And the watch smashed against the tree to mislead us about the time of death. It stopped at 7:14, but the real murder happened earlier, before the rain, around 6:30. The room tensed, eyes darting between suspects. Captain Tarbutton flushed, Elsie fidgeted with her handkerchief. Mrs. Hale stared fixedly at the carpet. Miss Marple laid down her needles with a soft clink, her voice gentle yet piercing as she spoke for the first time. "If I may, Dermot dear." All heads turned to the elderly lady, some with surprise, others with faint amusement. What could this knitting spinster know? But Craddock stepped aside with a respectful nod. "The floor is yours, Aunt Jane." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her blue eyes sweeping the room like a lighthouse beam. "Human nature is a curious thing, isn't it? So predictable in its unpredictability. Reginald Proctor was not a kind man. Greedy, quarrelsome, quick to wound those around him. Each of you had reason to wish him gone. Captain, the diverted stream. Elsie, the docked wages. Mr. French, the thwarted sail. Billy, the sacking for poaching. Mrs. Hale, the broken promises after 15 years of service." She paused, letting the motives hang in the air like smoke. "But the real murderer is the one who appeared to have no motive at all, or rather one that was hidden until the end. Mrs. Laura Hale." The housekeeper rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, her face ashen. "This is outrageous. I've done nothing but serve that man faithfully." Whispers erupted, Elsie's hand to her mouth, Billy's wide-eyed stare. Miss Marple continued calmly, undeterred. "You have served him for 15 years, Mrs. Hale. You knew his habits, his secrets. You knew he kept a new will in the apple loft, drawn up only last month, leaving everything to you. Home farm, the savings, the lot. But on Wednesday he changed his mind again, reinstating that distant cousin in Australia. You overheard him on the telephone to his solicitor, confirming the alteration. It must have been a bitter blow, 15 years of loyalty and nothing to show but dismissal." Mrs. Hale sank back into her chair, her rigid posture crumbling. He promised me, said I'd be taken care of." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Indeed. So you met him in the orchard at 6:30, before the rain fell, perhaps to plead your case one last time. But tempers flared. You quarreled. In a moment of rage, you seized the pitchfork you'd brought along, ostensibly to prop apple baskets, but really as a weapon of opportunity. You are tall, strong from years of farm work, and left-handed. The strike was swift and sure." Craddock interjected, holding up the bagged coat. "This was hidden in the loft. Yours? No, Proctor's spare, but stained with his blood from the struggle. You hid it there, along with the clean pitchfork to replace the bloody one, and planned to burn them later. But you returned today, panicked by our investigations." Miss Marple added softly, "The smashed watch was your misdirection, hurled against the tree afterward to suggest a later time, after Mr. French's train could not have arrived. And the footprints, laid with Billy's patched boots borrowed from the shed, walking backward to the body. Clever, but the even spacing gave it away. No one flees a murder so calmly," Elsie whispered. "But the ladder, the broken rung?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, yes. Only someone who climbed it regularly, like you, Mrs. Hale, would know to avoid the loose third rung on the left. A stranger would have faltered." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelations pressing down. Captain Tarbutton cleared his throat awkwardly. French exhaled in relief. Billy grinned despite himself. Mrs. Hale stared at Miss Marple for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. Then, as if a dam had broken, she sank her head into her hands. "He laughed at me," she whispered, her voice breaking. 15 years. And he laughed, said I was lucky to have a roof at all. I didn't mean to. But the pitchfork was there and the rage. Oh God. Sobs racked her frame, the confession spilling out in fragments. The quarrel, the fatal thrust, the frantic cover-up. Craddock stepped forward gently, signaling a constable at the door. "Mrs. Laura Hale, I'm arresting you for the murder of Reginald Proctor." As she was led away, subdued and weeping, the room exhaled collectively. Reverend Clement offered a quiet prayer. Elsie clung to her uncle. French lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, the needles resuming their rhythmic click. "Such a pity," she murmured. "But justice, like a well-made scarf, must be completed thread by thread." Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the village green, as St. Mary Mead began to heal from its little tragedy. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Apple Tart. 3 days had passed since the vicarage drawing-room had become a court of revelation, and St. Mary Mead had already begun folding the tragedy into the quiet layers of its history. The roped-off orchard was open again. The bramley tree stood serene as though it had never witnessed violence, and the hens at home farm scratched the yard with the same unconcern they had shown before their master died. Mrs. Laura Hale had been taken to Much Benham to await trial, and the distant cousin in Australia had been cabled the unexpected news that he was now the owner of a prosperous English farm. Life, as Miss Marple often observed, had a way of reasserting its gentle rhythm once the storm was over. On a bright, cold morning that carried the first true promise of winter, Miss Marple sat in the small walled garden behind Gossington Hall. A low fire crackled in the summer house, taking the chill off the air, and Joan had set a table with her best flowered cloth, a spirit lamp, and the silver teapot that had belonged to Raymond's grandmother. A freshly baked apple tart, made, of course, with Cox's orange pippins from home farm, sent curls of cinnamon-scented steam into the crisp sunlight. Raymond was away in London delivering a manuscript, leaving the two women to enjoy what Joan called a proper gossip over something sinful. Inspector Dermot Craddock arrived promptly at 11, his official car left discreetly at the gate so as not to alarm the neighbors. He removed his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and looked suddenly younger and rather sheepish. "Aunt Jane," he began, accepting a chair and a generous slice of tart, "I've come to eat humble pie along with the apple. You were quite right about the left-handed business, the ladder, the watch, everything. I should have seen it sooner." Miss Marple poured his tea with the same serene precision she brought to every task. "My dear Dermot, you saw a great deal. You simply allowed the village to persuade you that Billy Barnes's boots were the whole story. That is the danger of listening too much to the chorus and not enough to the soloist." Joan, pink with pleasure at the praise for her pastry, leaned forward. "But Aunt Jane, how did you know it was Mrs. Hale from the very beginning? She seemed so ordinary." Miss Marple smiled over the rim of her cup. "Ordinary people commit most murders, Joan dear, and Mrs. Hale had the one motive that is strongest of all, not hatred but injured love. 15 years of devotion, of polishing his boots and cooking his meals and listening to his complaints, and then to be told, quite casually, that it had all been for nothing. That is a wound to the heart that few women could bear in silence. I have seen it before, in quieter ways, in this very village." Craddock nodded slowly. "She confessed everything in the end. Said she went to the orchard meaning only to plead, carrying the pitchfork because she intended to prop some baskets afterward. When he laughed at her tears, something snapped. She struck once, then stood horrified at what she'd done. The rest, the watch against the tree, the footprints walked backward, the coat and ticket hidden in the loft, was pure panic trying to look like cunning. And the railway ticket? Joan asked wide-eyed. A red herring she planted herself, Craddock said. She'd found it in the yard weeks ago. Mr. French must have dropped it during one of his visits and kept it, thinking it might be useful one day. On the night of the murder, she tucked it into the coat pocket to point suspicion toward him. Poor planning, really. It only made us search the loft sooner. Miss Marple cut herself a second slender slice of tart. Human nature is always the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or in Belgravia. Greed, fear, love turn sour, the motives are limited, but the variations are endless. A little observation, a little knitting together of the threads, and there you are. Joan laughed softly. You make it sound like embroidery? Murder is embroidery of a sort, Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. Only the pattern is usually uglier, and one is obliged to finish it neatly for everyone's sake. Craddock finished his tea and set the cup down with a small sigh of contentment. Well, the chief constable is delighted. The newspapers have their headlines, and Mrs. Hale will be treated with as much kindness as the law allows. I suppose that's as happy an ending as one can hope for. Miss Marple looked out over the garden where the last roses were dropping their petals onto the grass. Happy is not quite the word, Dermot dear, but peaceful perhaps. The village will talk for a month, then the talk will fade, and someone else will win the prize for the heaviest marrow at next year's flower show. That is the comfort of English villages. Nothing is ever quite as important as we think it is at the time. Joan rose to fetch more hot water, and for a moment the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant lowing of cattle from home farm. Craddock watched Miss Marple as she selected a fresh skein of wool from her basket, pale pink, for a new baby expected at the vicarage in the spring. "You'll stay for lunch, won't you?" Joan called from the doorway. Craddock glanced at Miss Marple, who gave a tiny nod. "I'd be delighted," he said. As Joan disappeared inside, he leaned forward confidentially. "Tell me one thing, Aunt Jane. When did you first suspect Mrs. Hale? Was it the trembling hand at the vicarage tea?" Miss Marple's needles began their gentle dance. "No, dear. It was earlier, when she scattered grain to the hens the first morning I saw her after the murder. She used her left hand for everything, even though her right is perfectly good. Most people are not so consistent unless habit has become necessity. And then there was the way she spoke of Mr. Proctor, never Reginald, always Mr. Proctor, even after 15 years. That is the voice of someone who has loved without return and has learned to hide the wound under formality. Once I noticed that, the rest followed quite naturally." Craddock shook his head in admiration. "I shall never underestimate a knitting lady again." Miss Marple laughed, a soft, silvery sound. "Few people do, Dermot. That is why it is such a pleasant hobby." The sun climbed higher, gilding the garden wall and turning the apple tart crumbs to gold on their plates. Somewhere a church bell began to chime the hour, and the three of them sat in companionable silence, savoring the last sweet taste of a mystery solved and a village restored to its gentle, imperfect peace.